Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. I was just enjoying an evening beverage from my Disciple Dojo timeline of the Old Testament coffee mug. While wearing my Disciple Dojo Aroma of Christ t-shirt. Here's to shameless plugs. If you want any of this or other Disciple Dojo merchandise, that's one way you can support this ministry. Head over to our online store. I'll put a link in the video description. And anything you buy is much appreciated. You help show your support for Disciple Dojo, and you get some cool stuff in the process. So that's a win-win in my book. Okay, so this video is going to be a little different than our typical study Bible reviews or teaching videos. I had someone ask me, I think it was either on Instagram, you should totally be following me on Instagram if you're not already, or it might have been an email they sent through the website contact form over at discipledojo.org. But someone asked if I would give my thoughts on different commentaries or various study aids that people can use who are trying to better understand the Bible. And so I thought that would be a good series of videos here at the dojo. I'm not going to do in-depth reviews of commentaries or encyclopedias or Bible dictionaries because, good grief, that would take forever. But I do think it would be helpful if I were to share some of the resources that I find particularly helpful when I'm doing my own biblical studies that are floating around out there in Bible nerd land. And so in this video, I want to give you some resources that are helpful in studying the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. If you find this helpful, then I may do more in-depth videos on Genesis commentaries, Exodus commentaries, Leviticus commentaries, as well as other sections of the Bible. So if that's something that you would like to see, you can let me know by liking this video and leaving a comment in the comment section below on what you would find interesting or helpful or what you'd be most likely to watch. But I'm going to show you a number of resources I think will help you if you're trying to get a handle on those first 5 books of the Bible, the foundation of everything in Scripture, the Torah. Some I have in print and some I have on my digital library, so I'll be switching back and forth between the two. Now, the first 2 that I want to mention, I actually have in my Logos library. The first one is the Dictionary of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. This is edited by T. Desmond Alexander and David Baker by InterVarsity Press. Now, the reason I like this, I'll pull up the contents and show you, is because this is basically a dictionary of everything having to do with studying the Pentateuch. So if you click on any of the entries, you have articles. I just clicked on F randomly. So you have entries on faith, the fall, families, family relationships, famine, the fatherhood of God, the feasts. So if I click on festivals and feasts, then it takes me to the article that has to do with the festivals and the feasts that you're going to find in the Old Testament. And these are the different sections: critical questions, general vocabulary, specific nomenclature, sources for feasts and their distinctives. So these are pretty substantial articles. Some are longer than others, depending on what the subject is, but they go through all of these concepts, all of these things you're going to come across as you're reading through the first 5 books of the Bible. And they cover not just things you find in Scripture, but also things about the history of biblical interpretation. For instance, you can look up the article on the documentary hypothesis, and it'll say, see authorship of the Pentateuch, Pentateuchal criticism, history of, source criticism. So if you click on source criticism, then it's going to give you a whole article that has to do with authorships, the documentary hypothesis in particular, and different concepts that biblical scholarship, especially of the Pentateuch, is built upon. And in the back, it also has a scripture index. So you can find specific verses that you're studying, and you can see if there's an article that has to do with the content of those verses. And since this is Logos, these are all hyperlinks. So if I click on them, then it'll take me right to the point in the article where that passage is mentioned. So the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch is a very, very useful resource. And when I'm doing a study or a teaching of any Old Testament book, I will usually start there and read the article about that book just to get a general lay of the land. Now, this resource is not written primarily for scholars, although it is a scholarly resource. It's written at a level that educated lay people can understand. You don't have to have an MDiv, a THM, or a PhD to make your way through this, and you don't get bogged down with too many footnotes. Yet at the same time, it is at a scholarship level, and the contributors are all really reputable. Now, another resource in that same collection by InterVarsity is the New Dictionary of Biblical Theology. And this one's edited by T. Desmond Alexander and Brian Rosner. Now, this one is a little different. It has 3 parts, basically. Part 1 is the introduction, and this tells you about concepts having to do with biblical theology. So these are all of the different essays in that section. Then part 2 is what's really helpful for studying particular books, because it has a series of essays and articles on specific books of the Bible. What is the biblical theology of? Let's click on Genesis. And so here you'll have an introduction to Genesis, and then it'll have sections that deal with the different biblical theological themes you're going to find in Genesis, like creation and blessing, crime and curse, blessing for all nations, Abraham, David, Israel, Jesus Christ and the nations. So again, if I'm studying a book of the Bible, particularly a book in the Pentateuch, I will go to the article on that book in the New Dictionary of Biblical Theology, and I will read through and get an idea of the overall message of that book and where it fits in the wider biblical theological unfolding of Scripture. So those are 2 really useful resources, and most of the time, those are kind of my first stop when I'm getting ready to teach through or study a book of the Pentateuch. After that, I may want to consult some commentaries. And rather than going through individual commentaries on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, this video would be like 2 hours long. There are a couple of commentaries that I start at. Think of it as how you focus a camera, right? Like you get your scene blocked out first. When I'm focusing the camera here in the studio, I want to make sure that, okay, what's visible, how am I cropped in, what's in the shot. Then once I have the camera set, that's when I do the fine-tune focusing. Well, it's the same thing when you're studying Scripture. I want to get the general lay of the land. I want to get the main overall image cropped in. So that's what I use those previous resources for, as well as a few others. So then the next step into getting a general framed, blocked-in understanding of the book that I'm studying is to consult a 1-volume commentary. And by that, I mean commentaries that cover more than one book of the Bible. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just ones that I regularly use, and so I feel good commending to anybody watching this video. Now, first of all, I want to get the cultural background, the ancient Near East setting that the Pentateuch comes out of. And so for that, I highly recommend Zondervan's Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary, Volume 1. This is edited by John Walton, and it tells you right here at the top the books that it covers, which happen to be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So super convenient if you're a Torah student. Now, if you've seen any of our Bible background videos here on the channel, this should look familiar because this is where a lot of the concepts and the artwork and images come from. Each book is put together by a different author, and the goal is to show you how the ancient Near East world comes to bear on the passages of Scripture in question. So this is Genesis. You're getting a lot of background from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the ancient Near East that help put Genesis in its historical context. And that's crucial when you're setting out to interpret the Bible. You can't start reading Scripture asking, okay, what does this mean to me? You have to first ask, what did it mean to them? And Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament, that's a mouthful, is a great place to begin that aspect of your study. Then after that, we need to ask, in addition to the cultural background, what's the literary background? What's the overall place that the book I'm studying occupies within the big picture story of the Pentateuch? And that's where John Sailhamer's book, The Pentateuch as Narrative, has been really helpful. I don't always agree with Sailhamer's approach on a particular passage, but there's no interpreter out there that you're going to agree with everything they believe about Scripture. That's the point of reading multiple scholars. But what Sailhamer does very well is traces the overall story that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy present to the reader as a self-contained narrative, which is what he argues that the Pentateuch is. And Sailhamer makes connections that a lot of other scholars miss, showing how something in Genesis is important for something in Numbers. Something that pops up in Exodus is going to play a big part in Leviticus. He does a good job highlighting things that just in your own reading through the Pentateuch, you may miss as well. And I really, really like that about Sailhamer's Pentateuch as narrative commentary. Then a newer resource that I haven't used as much as others because I recently got it just within the past few months, but I want to share it with you because what I have used from it is great. And that's this volume, The Old Testament Use of the Old Testament. What it does is it goes through book by book and shows how other places in the Old Testament use particular passages from the Old Testament. It's by Gary Edward. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that last name, but I'll put a link in the description below and you can take your best shot. But the reason I like it, there are a number of commentaries out there that talk about how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, which is super important, but there aren't very many that talk about how the Old Testament uses the Old Testament. So this is a really helpful resource. I encourage you to check it out. Then the next stop is to see how different scholars have approached the Old Testament, the Pentateuch in particular, from different ends of the spectrum. And that's where these two come into play. From a more conservative Protestant evangelical perspective, Gleason Archer's volume, A Survey of the Old Testament Introduction. Archer's book is going to start with a general introduction to the Old Testament. So there's going to be essays like the Hebrew manuscripts and the early versions, lower criticism of the Old Testament, the canon of the Old Testament, history of the documentary theory of the Pentateuch, higher criticism of the Pentateuch in the 20th century, authorship of the Pentateuch, and then a series of articles that really get into the weeds on the Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, which is the assumed foundation that many, if not most, Old Testament scholars today operate from. And Archer is going to argue against the grain of a lot of Old Testament scholarship. He's coming from a much more conservative perspective. So if you're studying the Pentateuch, one of the biggest issues is authorship. Who wrote it? Well, you need to know the arguments for both sides, and so if you want arguments for what would be considered Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, then you're going to get that in Archer's volume. Then more to the other end of the spectrum, the New Interpreter's Bible, Volume 1. A number of the concepts that Archer discusses are also discussed in the New Interpreter's Bible, and for the most part, they are going to come from scholars who take a much different view than Archer. They're going to come more from mainline liberal Protestantism, whereas Archer is coming from evangelical conservative Protestantism. It gives you an introduction of how more mainline or liberal scholarship approaches those same issues. Now, I don't just want to operate from a Western academic, North American, or European context, and that's where these next two volumes are very helpful. I always check the Africa Bible commentary. This is a commentary put together entirely by African scholars, and it walks through every book of the Bible. So when I'm studying the Pentateuch, I check out what the Africa Bible commentary scholars writing on the Pentateuch have to say. And it's really helpful because the issues that African Christians face are often pretty different than issues that North American Christians have to face. So there's more of an emphasis in this volume on things that were quite normal in ancient Israel that we today in the West, and I say we meaning people in my region of the world, find really odd. But they're perfectly normal in African contexts. Things like polygamy, things like ancestor worship, things like mediums and sorcery. Those are things that the Western world has all but dismissed as completely irrelevant. Yet, talk to Christians in Africa, you'll get a different picture. It's also really helpful in understanding things like imperialism. Empires in the ancient world like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, they would take over regions. They would impose their rule upon them. Well, that's something that's pretty familiar to most Christians throughout the continent of Africa. So the Africa Bible commentary helps me see certain blind spots that I might have when reading a passage of Scripture as a Western North American. But just like North America isn't the center of the universe, neither is Africa. And so another resource that's very similar in its scope and in its purpose that I use is the South Asia Bible commentary. Now, much like the Africa Bible commentary, the South Asia Bible commentary is put together entirely by scholars in South Asia. And South Asia mainly comprises what we would call the Indian subcontinent. So places like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, that's where all of these scholars are coming from. And just like the Africa Bible commentary, if you've spent any time in South Asia, there are certain things culturally that are very relevant and important there that get completely missed by those of us in the West. And so, for example, in India, questions about idolatry, like literal idols, graven images, worshiping, bringing offerings or sacrifices to various gods, at a temple through the use of an idol with a priest. I mean, that is something that every Indian is familiar with because that is entirely at home in a Hindu pantheistic culture. Likewise, arranged marriages. That's the norm in most parts of India. Well, that was the norm in the Old Testament as well. So there are a number of things that modern Western North American Christians often miss, or at least don't have a full appreciation for, simply because they're foreign to us and they seem like something that only happened in the ancient world. But that's not the case. So these are examples of two resources. There are others out there that also do this from an East Asian perspective or a Central European perspective or a Middle East perspective. I haven't had a chance to get my hands on copies of those, so I can't speak to how good they are. But I have used both of these extensively in my own teaching preparation. And lastly, when you're studying the Old Testament and the Pentateuch in particular, the Torah, you're going to come across things that are just weird. You're going to come across things that are confusing. You're going to come across passages that are hard to understand, that are disturbing. I think of confusing passages like Genesis 6, the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, or the book of Numbers, and Balaam and his donkey talking to him. Or some of the commands in Exodus having to do with slavery, or in Deuteronomy having to do with what on first reading seems like ethnic cleansing or genocide. There are things that are just hard to understand, hard to wrap our minds around, or just ethically, morally hard to swallow. You're going to come across those when you're studying the Old Testament. So a resource that I found incredibly helpful over the years in approaching those issues is Hard Sayings of the Bible. This is edited by Walt Kaiser, Peter Davids, F.F. Bruce, and Manfred Brock. Now, Walt Kaiser was my professor back at Gordon Conwell, and I had him for a number of classes, and he is somebody that I think anyone studying the Pentateuch should know and whose work they should be familiar with, even if they don't agree with everything. I don't agree with everything that Kaiser taught, but I cherished being a student of such a fantastic Old Testament scholar. And one of my favorite resources of Walt Kaiser's is this one. The opening essays alone are worth the price of the book because they cover things like, how do we know who wrote the Bible? Can we believe in Bible miracles? Why does God seem so angry in the Old Testament and loving in the New? Why don't Bible genealogies always match up? Aren't many Old Testament numbers wrong? Do the dates of the Old Testament kings fit secular history? Does archaeology support Bible history? And then after a general overview of things like that, it goes into specific hard sayings in specific books of the Bible. So whenever I'm reading and I come across a passage that's hard to interpret, hard to understand, or that just doesn't sit well with me, I always check and see if Kaiser and Davids and others have written on it, have dealt with that passage in particular. And one of the things I really like about this book is that even when they take a position on something, let's say the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, a very hard passage to interpret in Genesis 6. Well, what Hard Sayings does really well is it lays out the different views that Christians have taken. And it gives you kind of the strengths and the weaknesses of each view. And then at the end, it will tell you where the particular contributor lands on that view. So I find that even when I don't fully agree with a particular reading of a passage, they've helped me see the different options at least and given me a starting point for how to process how others have approached that particular passage in the Pentateuch. So those are some resources that I think are helpful for giving you kind of that initial framing and pulling into focus a little tighter. Now, we haven't completely focused. That's where you would have to go to individual volumes, individual commentaries on Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or whatever book of the Torah you're studying. But in terms of getting the overall view, the big picture, the lay of the land, these are resources that I've used and that I think are a good starting point. And then from there, you just dig. You just dig down deeper. You find a passage or a chapter, get a commentary on that book and look at how the interpreter dealt with that chapter or that passage. Then you have more of a question about a particular verse, go to a more technical commentary that goes verse by verse. If you have a question about a Hebrew term or how the Septuagint handled a certain translation, or the more nerdy you want to get, the deeper you have to dig. And so look at it as similar to how archaeologists dig. First, you may have to come in with a bulldozer. You may have to move a lot of earth to get down to where there's going to be treasure. So you do that first. Then you start digging with shovels and pickaxes to get some of that debris out of the way. Then when you're in an area where you're like, hey, there's treasure here or there's something important here, and I don't want to mess it up by just blasting away, what do? Well, then you get out the hand spades. And then when you get down to something that's very important, you get the little scalpel, or you may have a toothbrush to move little bits of dirt. Well, it's like that when you're studying the Bible. Start big, get the lay of the land, clear out all of the big things with tools that have a wider focus, like full volume commentaries, introductions to the Pentateuch, things like that. Then the more you dig down, use more precise tools. Pull in a 1-volume commentary. Then pull in a particular commentary that covers a book. Then pull in a commentary that covers a part of a book. Then do a search for journal articles or encyclopedia entries in Bible dictionaries or biblical encyclopedias that deal with that particular verse or concept or word. Go to a lexicon. Do a word study. I mean, this is just how you do biblical studies. So the purpose of this video, once again, these are resources that I use that I find helpful. You may find them helpful. I'll put links to where you can find all of them in the video description below. If you want to see videos like this for particular books of the Bible, leave it in the comment section below. If I get interest on this video, we'll do more of them. I've got a whole shelf here, and I'm happy to share my thoughts on how I approach biblical studies if you think that would be helpful. So let me know in the comments. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more Bible reviews, more teaching videos, more superhero seminary episodes. And in the meantime, click around here on the channel. We got a lot of playlists with a number of different topics that we deal with. So see if there's something you like. And if you do come across something you find interesting, share it. That's one of the best ways that you can support this ministry. Tell other people about what we're doing here at Disciple Dojo. Our goal, to equip, engage, and empower God's people to better understand and live out what they find in Scripture. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.